Okay, good morning and welcome to this double lecture on geopolitical risk. More specifically, this lecture will be about security risks and terrorism. And I'll divide this lecture as well up into different parts, smaller parts. And I'll first talk a little bit about the terrorism phenomenon in general, definitions, actors, and I'll also we'll also look at certain recent trends and not so recent trends in the number of attacks, etc. And secondly, we'll deal more specifically with the impact of terrorism on international business, both indirect and direct impacts. And thirdly, I'll also speak about a case from the hotel industry, which is on the reading list. And I'll talk a little bit about why it is that hotels are often targeted, big hotel chains. And fourthly, we have this infamous example of Statoil, the Norwegian oil company, which is now called Equinor, and the horrible terrorist attack that Equinor or Statoil experienced back in 2013 in Algeria. So these are the four basic things we'll deal with in this double lecture. And this, by the way, is a picture of the terrorist attack in Mumbai in India back in 2008, a spectacular attack by a Pakistani-based group, and the whole thing lasted a couple of or 3 days actually, and it was a massive news coverage of it live for days, and this Mumbai attack is dealt with in the article on the readings, which focuses on these hotel attacks. Okay, firstly, you have a book chapter which is fairly broad and general. It's the introduction to a book by Chastity on corporate security, Crossroads, and that book deals with, of course, the interface between international businesses and terrorists and non-state actors. If we take the definition, one description of the phenomenon, what are we talking about? At its core, political terrorism involves the threat, promotion, or use of force against non-combatants to influence the political dispositions of government leaders or the policy dispositions of the nation state, or both. And if we take the second, and as well, the threat or use of violence to attain a political goal through intimidation, fear, or coercion, it means that what we're talking about are non-state actors with a political goal. And political can be, in a broad sense, and one often includes, religious goals about overturning or changing different parts of society. But at base, you have to have objectives that go beyond, mere profits. We're not talking about ordinary criminals, although their methods can be the same often. So in a country like Nigeria, for instance, you have a lot of criminality, not least in the south of the country, where much of the oil is to be found. But you also have these rebel groups with political goals, and even goals that seek independence for the oil-rich Niger Delta and the surrounding areas. So sometimes it's difficult to separate these two types of groups. But in general, political goal, non-state actors, and you use violence, some sort of violence. not least with the ultimate aim of overturning something in society, in politics, and often by creating instability, intimidation, fear. And that's the thing about terrorism. It often has enormous effects that go beyond just, you know, the attack itself. It creates fear, and we know that pretty well from in particular in the last few years, or more specifically between 2015, 2017, 18 in Europe, where a number of attacks, not in an enormous number of attacks, but a large handful of terrorist attacks in various places, in Paris, in Nice, in France, in Brussels, in Stockholm, and etc. They created effects that went far beyond the attacks themselves, even though the attacks were horrible. You create an atmosphere, a feeling of insecurity, of threat. So you create, by acting in that way, by doing terrorist attacks, you create enormous effects often. And you often think, the terrorist groups, that, you know, it's a battle of willpower. You weaken the will of the state and society, and there's a lot of psychological effects involved when it comes to terrorism. So, of course, there are different groups with different objectives, different kinds of organization, different. You have some very local groups, you have regional groups, national groups, transnational, global groups, and we've gotten almost used to these global groups like Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, in particular since the ultimate terrorist attacks, to put it like that, against the US in September 11th, 2001. So you have different sorts of agendas. You have some groups, of course, fighting or instituting terrorist attacks based on, you know, based on ethnicity, ethnic-based groups that fight for it can be justice, it can be political control. And as long as these are non-state groups, and this is a vital issue, as long as these are non-state groups using violence for political purposes, they're deemed terrorists. Even though you can often argue that, hey, their objectives are sound or understandable, they seek justice. But technically, formally, they're terrorists. So we don't usually, in research at least, we don't usually do the normative stuff or value judgment of the goals of terrorist groups. Some people, they understand that Hamas in the Palestinian territories, they understand, many people, that, okay, you want to change something politically, given the situation with the Israeli occupation and all that. And you use violence to attain those objectives, attempt to attain a level of justice in from the perspective of the Palestinians. These are terrorist groups nonetheless. Even if you're of the opinion, if you are of the opinion that, you know, they seek justice and they're freedom fighters, one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. But they're terrorists formally, irrespective of the goals. And then, of course, you know, you can have states using the same means, using violence against, you know, parts of the population. Technically, that's not terrorism because it's conducted by a state. So that's really the, let's call it the value neutral point of view. that if you're a non-state actor, you use violence to attain some political objective, you're by definition a terrorist group. Okay, so you have the ethnic-based, you have many groups striving for self-determination or even an independent state. That has been quite common in many places. You have ideologically based groups. That used to be common in the 1970s, for instance. Left-wing radicals, left-wing terrorist groups, blowing up pipelines or attacking large businesses, etc. It's rarer today to find these ideology-based terrorist groups. But what we find more and more are religion-based terrorist groups, in particular in the Islamic world. So you have the jihadist or the militant Islamists. And I'll switch between those two concepts, jihadists and militant Islam, which I'll talk a little bit about later, which has introduced something new and more, let's call it spectacular, more horrifying also, more horrifying dimension to the terrorism phenomenon. Not least because the number of people getting killed in terrorist attacks has risen quite dramatically since these jihadist groups really started growing and spreading. You know, the terrorism in the 1970s, 80s, the ideological terrorism, or even the ethnic-based self-determination terrorism, like in Spain, the ETA terrorist group or / political movement in the Basque region, they rarely killed people. They rarely killed civilians. And the IRA in Northern Ireland rarely killed civilians on purpose. They often killed civilians, but that was deemed collateral damage almost. And that's something that has changed in recent times. The religion-based groups, and by far the majority of these groups are militant Islamists. The casualties are often enormous. Thirdly, you have a separation. You can separate between different forms of organization. It used to be the way that hierarchical groups were most common. Hierarchy, you had a leader, you had the people below there. It was centrally organized. And we know that Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, and several other groups now have a more decentralized structure, which means you have different operating cells and very few direct and obvious links between these cells in different countries and, the central leadership. So you have Al-Qaeda used to be run by Osama bin Laden. Now you have Ayman al-Zawahiri as the leader of Al-Qaeda, but he doesn't control, all the various subparts of the Al-Qaeda organization. It's decentralized, which also make it difficult to eradicate such a group. In a hierarchy, centrally organized organization, if you take out the top people, you often take out the organization, and in particular if the leader is a really symbolic figure, a charismatic figure, it's much more difficult with a decentralized structure. So even if you take out the top leadership, the different cells survive, and the ultimate objectives often also survive. So, just a graph. I haven't double checked it. But it looks okay, and I know it gives a decent picture of the situation from the 1970s and until recent time, 2016-17. And the green line is the number of incidents, the red, number of deaths, and the purple, it's a number of injuries. And we see some ups and downs, and in particular, of course, we know 2001, 9/11, and then we have the rise of the Islamic State together with, you know, the collapse in the central authority of the Syrian state and, of course, also the Iraqi state. So that's really the main story of these years from 2014 in particular, but also before that, because the Islamic State was used to be within the Al-Qaeda organization, and it broke out eventually. So you had a spike, a really large spike, and you had the declaration of the so-called caliphate, which stretched over fairly large territories in Syria and Iraq. The declaration by the Islamic State, we have a territory, they say. That happened in the formal declaration was, I think, in early 2015. And thereafter you had, you know, you established a group that were a success. You know, you have a territory, you have a caliphate, which you haven't had for a very, very long time. With the Islamic, you know, back to the roots of the old Islamic way of life. It's a success, and success attracts people. So the group recruited a lot of people, fighters, to go to Syria, to live in a caliphate, to fight, you know, the infidels, and to fight Shia Muslims as well. Islamic State is a Sunni Muslim group, and you have a lot of sectarianism in their ideology. So the group grew, the territory grew, until eventually a couple of things happened, and most importantly was most likely the military actions against the Islamic State, led by the US and its Western allies, which eventually led to the essential collapse of the so-called caliphate. And that also helped reduce the number of attacks by the Islamic State in Europe. Because, you know, in the second half of 2017, along with the military success of the anti-Islamic State coalition in Syria and Iraq, along with that, you saw a drop in these attacks, these major attacks, these coordinated attacks. Because if you control territory as a terrorist group, if you do that in Afghanistan, like before 2001, before 9/11, Al-Qaeda controlled, they were invited and could have their bases and for training and planning attacks. They were welcomed by the regime, and to a certain extent helped by the Taliban regime. That gives them an opportunity to plan and eventually execute a sophisticated attack, a really sophisticated attack, which happened on 9/11. And the same story is really true for the Islamic State. So some of the attacks in Europe in 2016 and 17 were coordinated attacks, fairly complex, not on the level of 9/11, but the security and relative stability and territorial control give them a base for planning and executing more sophisticated attacks. But numbers have dropped after the end of the caliphate, so to speak, and after, you know, internal security in European countries were beefed up as the attacks mounted in 2016 and 17. that led, in Europe at least, to a drop. In other countries, not so large a drop. This graph shows pretty much the same story. A big spike around, you know, that time period where the Islamic State was growing, and then a drop as the Caliphate ended and internal security in Europe grew. But the basic point here is, if you look at the countries affected by terrorism, it's not about Europe, it's certainly not about the US. The US has far more right-wing terrorist attacks than jihadist attacks, for instance, but a lot more, you know, shootings and massacres, which is without a political goal, hence not deemed to be terrorism. It's really a problem for ungovernable states. States where you don't have a solid central government. States where you can say you have a vacuum, a governance vacuum, which you still to a certain degree have in Iraq and parts of Syria, although it used to be worse, which you still have to a large degree in Afghanistan, which you still have in the so-called Sahel belt south of the Saharan desert in Africa. So you have these countries, Mali and Mauritania and Niger and Burkina Faso, which has really been a central focus now in recent times for the Islamic State and also for Al-Qaeda, for jihadists. These are ungovernable, really, spaces where you can, through violence, perhaps gain territorial control and freedom of movement, really, for this group. So that's where you really have these attacks, along with, you know, some of these usual suspects. Nigeria have had for many decades a severe terrorism problem. It has spread in recent years. It used to be located in the south of the country, in the oil-rich parts of that state. But in recent years, you have had a different sort of terrorism, jihadist terrorism, Boko Haram in the north. And of course, you have other states with fairly consistent terrorism problems. Pakistan is such a country. So this is not a particular European problem, US problem. The problem is far worse in other areas of the world, in parts of South Asia, parts of the Middle East, and parts of Africa as well. So the Western, if we take the Western point of view, we see something, you know, some of the similar trends are visible. You have the jihadist attacks here. This is from the newspaper The Economist. And you have right-wing attacks here. Of course, we know this one from was the terrible terrorist attacks in Oslo and Utøya back in 2011. And you have a concentration really here of, you know, the Islamic State grew in popularity, acquired territory, planned and executed a lot of attacks in Europe, and also inspired a lot of smaller scale attacks in Europe, which are then thought to be, you know, within this Islamic group, Islamic State group phenomenon. Earlier you had some, you know, spread attacks, often by Al-Qaeda linked cells in London, in Madrid, terrible train bombings in Madrid. But you have this concentration here, and then you have the collapse of the caliphate, increased security, intelligence in Europe, and then you have, you know, a lower level, a far lower level. But the risk is there in Europe, and you've had a number of planned attacks, because most terrorist attacks are discovered before they're executed. And this is, you know, this slow-moving but vital police and intelligence work. So, this is the opening of this lecture. I'll take a short break and then I'll move on to the relationship between terrorism, or the impact of terrorism, on international business.